We're joined now by former Army officer and weapons expert Colonel Hamish de Bretton Gordon. Also with us, human rights lawyer Mark Guthrie. Thank you both for joining us. So to you, Hamish, first, and we heard there quite clearly he said cluster munitions, which is against international law. At least that was the perception just watching what was going on in Kharkiv. What did you make of it?
Well, certainly I've seen the same pictures as well, and I've seen cluster munitions used in Syria, and it looked very much like that was the case. But having said that, of course, Russia is not a signatory to the Cluster Munitions Convention. So as far as Putin is concerned, he doesn't really care. And certainly what I've seen in Syria in the last 6 years, which is very much a foretaste of what we're going to see in Kiev and other cities. The Russians use any irregular or asymmetric weapons that they can get hold of. We've already seen them use white phosphorus, which is an incendiary device to set towns and villages on fire. That is certainly a crime and should be reported as well. We've seen potentially thermobaric vacuum bombs, I think they're being called in the press now, which are indiscriminate. And I'm sure my colleague on the panel tonight will be much better placed to the legalistics part of it. And
I'll go to Mark.
By attacking civilians, that is against the law. OK,
and I'll go to Mark in just a moment. But just explain to us, when we talk about a cluster bomb, what exactly do we mean and how much damage can it cause?
Well, they are horrific, very small explosive devices that are packed in the shell of a missile, so that they generally explode a few feet above the ground. And in each shell, there may be thousands of these little cluster bombs that then explode. Now, one of the horrific things is only 50% of them usually ever go off. And I've seen in Afghanistan and Syria and also Iraq, you then get young children picking them up, which then explode and then kill them. So they are horrific. And the key thing is they're completely indiscriminate and certainly have, no viable military role to play in this particular conflict, and certainly shouldn't. And we do need to call them out.
All right. In which case, Mark, if they're being used indiscriminately and if they are hitting civilians, that is against international humanitarian law, isn't it? What happens then?
Well, that's right. You're talking here about grave breaches of the Geneva Convention of 1948, to which both Russia and Ukraine are party, and intentionally directing attacks against civilians or civilian objects would be a war crime. Prosecuting war crimes in these circumstances isn't going to be straightforward. Ordinarily, the responsibility for prosecuting war crimes rests upon states. So it would be for Ukraine to prosecute where war crimes have been committed on its territory. Russia would be entitled to prosecute, but barring a seismic political change in Russia, that's not going to happen. Now, there's been talk recently of the International Criminal Court, which is in The Hague, becoming involved. But the International Criminal Court is a court of last resort. Its jurisdiction is complementary to the national courts. The prosecutor there, Karim Khan, has said he's about to start an investigation. And Lithuania, which is a party to the Rome Statute of the International Criminal Court, has asked for him to investigate. I should also say that although Ukraine is not a party, it does recognize a jurisdiction of the International Criminal Court. Russia withdrew from the treaty, the Rome Treaty of the International Criminal Court, back in 2014.
Right. And Mark, we know as well that it can take a very long time, actually, to bring anyone to justice. We know that from people like Radovan Karadzic, the Bosnian Serb war criminal. It took about 20 years to get him to justice. But Hamish, I want to talk to you about what happens now with Western weapons, the Western allies' weapons that are being supplied to Ukraine, if they are facing the cluster bombs, if they're facing the thermobaric bombs, what can they counter with?
Well, I think we're entering a key phase of this battle. When it comes to fighting in the towns and cities, and you described the 40-mile column of armoured vehicles heading towards Kiev, that is where our weapons will really help the Ukrainians, because once those tanks get into built-up areas, they will be very, very vulnerable. And unless the Russians can take Kiev in a matter of days, they could be stuck there for ages. I was around the siege of Aleppo in Syria, and the Russians fought for 4 years to take Aleppo, but were battered back by determined young men and women with anti-tank weapons like the ones that the British have given them.
Okay.
And actually, at the end of the day, the Russians and the Syrians only defeated Aleppo after 4 years by using chemical weapons and other irregular weapons. So I hope we're getting into a phase where our weapons, and hopefully the advice and the intelligence that we can give the Ukrainians, will allow them to hold the Russians back from Kiev and the other major cities.
Colonel Hamish de Bretton Gordon and Mark Guthrie, we appreciate your expertise. Thanks very much for joining us.